So I have here a Rhino model, and the Rhino model, the way I organize my layers is I'll model um, part by part, going into more and more detail every time. And the layers not only are organized by phase, going from less detail to more detail, but also by material. So you'll notice I have very general layers up here for like the general scene, such as the walls, the dock that I have around the building. And then for the model, I have piping and glass. That means for me more like the windows. The mullions in this case are just straight pipes onto the glass, et cetera, et cetera. I've had a couple things imported into this file, so it's not the cleanest thing yet, but as long as you know which layers are organized into what materials, that's good enough. Okay, so we're gonna get started with our first material, or first step for V-Ray. And once you have V-Ray installed, actually, and if you are using the evaluation version, you're gonna wanna go under render in Rhino, and down at the bottom, you can select your current renderer. And after installing V-Ray, make sure that you set it to V-Ray for Rhino off of the Rhino render. After that, under the V-Ray tab at the top of Rhino, you could go to help, license, license server. And so from there, you'll be able to sign into your Chaos Group account. And if you have an evaluation taken out, then it'll be applied to your V-Ray after you sign in on your browser. And that's it for activating V-Ray. You just have to pull up the toolbar afterwards. I have mine set up over here onto the right. And the cool thing about V-Ray for Rhino is that, I mean, the cool and the not so cool thing about it is that it is one of the more limited versions of V-Ray. It's good because everything you learn in V-Ray for Rhino transfers to V-Ray for Cinema 4D, for 3ds Max, for Maya, for Blender. And V-Ray for Rhino is also most like V-Ray for Revit. So they're good places to start. This main one over here is the asset editor, and this is our main window for working with V-Ray. So you want to set it somewhere that's comfortable to you. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to select a view, because you want to work renders through a view. Once you get your model to a point where, for example, this is the project here in the center, this is going to be my foreground for my view. And my background, I'm going to switch to shaded mode so you can see how this model's put together. My background are really simple surfaces that are just going to make up different aspects. And I'm going to go into more detail on that with textures. But even the landscape isn't that high resolution. But I'm going to select a view over here. I'm going to go with a view I know works that I have been working with, which is something like this. And once I have that, I'm going to save it as either a snapshot or a named view in Rhino. So in this case, I'm using snapshots. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to just select the camera position. I'm also going to save my layer states, meaning which layers are previewed right now and which ones are hidden. And OK. So now I can revert back to this view no matter what. And I want to work off of this view, right? Once you have enough detail in the model that can function for your drawings, for rendering, you really just want to work through the views. So with this view, I'm going to go into my asset editor. I'm going to keep my asset editor over here on the right. I'm going to hit the gear to go to the main settings. Now, these main settings are where you want to set up for an interactive render. An interactive render is a render that isn't final quality. It's a render that you can move around in V-Ray, zoom in and zoom out, and the render will update as you're making changes. So that's what we're about to get into right now. We're going to add a couple textures in interactive mode. And once we add the texture, we'll start with lighting. Then we'll move on to textures. And after textures, before exporting, I'll show you a couple little other tricks before then. Any questions so far about installation or general use of the asset editor within Rhino? Okay. So under interactive mode, I have it over here enabled. So interactivity low, this, the higher the interactivity is, the quicker the rendering is going to be. I'm going to keep it at medium. And then update effects. So at the end means, do I want it to update as I'm orbiting around? Well, no, not really. I want it to update at the end of finishing moving. That way, if I double click on the snapshot as well, it's not loading the render as an animation as I'm moving into that scene. It's going to render once I reach the scene. Um,
How did you get the mountains in there? Like,
these
yeah.
were made in Grasshopper. It's really just it's a simple process. You could look up height fields, or I mean, height field is in Rhino, or you can look up mesh topographies, and you essentially can take satellite imaging or just an image of terrain, turning it
Yeah.
into like a grayscale picture, and then having the points on the mesh reflect the brightness and darkness of the topography. And I just copied, mirrored it, and scaled it, and rotated it, and made it
Yeah.
look different.
Where's the actual site?
This is someone reminded me of the name of this project, one of these past workshops, and I keep forgetting. It's Corbusier's first project that he did for his parents. So it's in a coast in France, but it has nothing to do with the actual backdrop I have set up here.
Okay.
Right. So last thing of the main render settings, we have the denoiser over here. So the denoiser is essentially what cleans up. I'll get into that later. I'm going to keep it off for now. It essentially just cleans up like all these rogue pixels in your render. Last thing for now, I'm going to do a material override because I'm not worrying about materials just yet. I'm just going to worry about lighting. So once I have that set up, I want to make sure that my Rhino Sun is turned on. And over here for environment, there's a section here for background. And the default background for Rhino is kind of like a white and gray image that you would see here. So the environment texture here I've loaded is an HDRI file, which is essentially a 360 image that has lighting values corrected for projecting these lights onto the model. So if you have the default Rhino environment texture, and it's like white and gray, it's going to be like really like burn up your render a little bit. So I would recommend going into an downloading a free HDRI. There's a bunch available online. These that I have here from 1 to 10, they go from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. So let's say I go for something later in the afternoon, like number 8. Looks a little bit earlier than what I expected, but that's fine. I'll run with it, and I'll go back. With that environment texture set up, it's going to be now affecting the lighting that's going to affect the model. So in interactive mode, this right here, this teapot with the finger on it means that it's to start rendering, and the finger means it's in interactive mode. So once that finger's removed and you just see the teapot, it means it's ready to render final quality. Okay. So that's what my clay render is looking like right now. Can everyone see all right? In previous experience with V-Ray, it may take a little bit longer for Zoom to show you the rendering. Are there any HDRI online pages you recommend us? I usually just type free HDRI into Google. The paid ones are obviously way better quality and much more stunning, but the free ones are just fine to move away from the default in your usual rendering software. But yeah, I don't have a specific page. I usually just Google for free HDRIs and run into something useful pretty quickly. This is overly bright. I'm gonna turn off the Rhino Sun. It changed that condition just a little bit, but it's still just overly bright. And I'm gonna go to my main settings now in the V-Ray asset editor. And under camera here, I don't have the default exposure value. When you start a new Rhino file or your default Rhino, V-Ray exposure value here would be 10. So this is what you would be seeing. I reverted this file back from a really advanced level, try to bring it back to what it looks like when it's default, but there's something I might have missed. The exposure value is one thing. I had it around 6, so by default it's 10. And so this is what the model's looking like right now with no textures. So as you can see with interactive mode, I can take a pretty good look at how the lighting is looking. Now, I turned off my V-Ray Rhino Sun or my Rhino Sun, sorry. If I turn it back on, it's not really making a difference. I can increase the intensity or decrease the intensity. I can also, I'm going to turn the Rhino document Sun off, but if I go back to the background, I can also add a multiplier here to the background environment. So I can go up to 2, 3. So here I'm adding intensity to the background effects onto the model, but notice it's not actually affecting the brightness of the background. The perspective of the background is all right. But say, and the sun is quite low. If I wanted to change the way that the environment is placed here, this checker box where I set that image, right, is a texture slot. So once I hit the texture slot, that brings me back to my environmental lighting. If I hit this folder here, that's where I selected the HDRI. But down here, I have an option for texture placement. So this little window on the right is going to give you the settings for whatever's underneath this preview here. And if this is not showing up for you, if all you see is this main menu, you have to hit this arrow over here on the right to bring up this asset editor. So again, here on your left side, you're going to have your menu, and on the right side, you're going to be able to edit any texture or any other sort of element that you're able to manipulate in V-Ray. And you'll always have those checker box options for certain things, and we'll get into that a little bit more later with texturing. But what I want to show you for texture placement is right here. The texture placement is environmental. It's spherical, so it's essentially mapping that image as a sphere around our environment, and we can rotate that environment different ways here. So if I wanted to turn the image, if I wanted to change the position of the sun, I could just rotate the image. And then when I rotate in the Rhino model, I'll see that the sun is in a different position. Now it's on the other side, right? 180 degrees. So let's see if I can get the lighting source right in front of the building. Now it's behind, right? I want it to be over there. So it's actually from 0, it's going to go 90 degrees. Okay, so there my sun is kind of oriented in front of the building. So I can go back, double click on my snapshot, so it takes me back to my scene. Give that a little bit. And once it reaches there, render updates. Okay, I'm getting some front light, which is pretty cool. And the last thing for lighting, then I'll take questions on lighting. I'm gonna do a little cheat. You can mess with the Rhino Sun settings and position it properly and so on, but something I like to do just for effect, I get out of perspective view, but that's still what I'm gonna be seeing on my interactive render. And I'm gonna zoom out of the side views so that I make sure that I identify the front of the project, which is right here. And right. So with my V-Ray tools, I'm going to hit the drop-down menu here for lights, which are shown in orange, and I'm going to pick a directional light. Now, the origin for my directional light, I'm going to set it to be just right in front of the project, and the arrow comes up, and I'm going to try and get the angle right on the lighting source here. So I'm going to keep this open here. It's kind of coming from in front, but just a little bit above the cantilever here. So I'm actually going to try and locate that cantilever somewhere here and add that light source at that angle. A little bit lower. Right there, it's gonna blast it with light, but it's no problem because now I can go here to my lights in my V-Ray asset menu editor. Directional light, I can decrease the intensity down by a lot. And this is where you have to kind of play with the lighting effects. So I'm gonna actually decrease the intensity from the environmental light. There we go. And I am also going to decrease my exposure value. So I'm gonna type in 8. Oh no, that makes it brighter. I'm gonna type in 11, 12. 12 is fine. That gives me a little bit more play with the directional light. And I am going to color it what I saw the environment color to be. So I look at the sun again and I try to get that color right. It's not quite orangey. It's like right between yellow and orange and pretty bright. So here I'm gonna just click on the color for that directional light on the right side. Kind of go for that tone. Something like that. Go back to my scene. And from here, it's kind of doing that, adjusting the value of the environmental light, adjusting the value of the directional light, adjusting your exposure values. If you're into photography, you have in the main settings, advanced camera parameters. So you have film sensitivity. So since it is darker, I'm gonna put the film sensitivity to like 800. Probably should have maybe defaulted these two before I got started over here, but larger aperture number for bringing more things into focus. Faster shutter speed for getting rid of some light so that I can bring up the intensity again on the environment because I kind of like that. There you go. So more intense passive lighting, and the directional light is still on, pretty weak, but it is adding something. I can turn it off here and see what the directional light is doing for the project. Any questions on lighting or on the interface here for manipulating lighting? No, pretty straightforward. All right. So we're gonna get into texturing. And I'm gonna hit stop over here to stop the rendering. I could have also hit it where I started the render. Bring my perspective view. Keep this here. So for textures, I'm just gonna load I'm gonna make it really easy on myself. And first pick the texture for the actual project. So I'm gonna hit the folder here for opening a project. Sorry, not opening a project, opening a texture. I'm gonna click right here to open a texture. I'm going to go for, you can find under your program files. So wherever you installed V-Ray, it's gonna be a folder called chaos groups under your chaos group, under your program files. Under V-Ray, V-Ray for Rhinoceros, library, materials, and then under materials you have here a whole bunch of different categories. So I'm gonna pick the concrete for the building because it's something most of you are gonna have to use. So under concrete, you're not able to see them here. If you open up the maps folder in your file explorer, I'm gonna do that real quick. Not from here, but from here. If I open V-Ray for Rhinoceros, that same folder for materials, under maps, I can preview the texture, the base images that are being used for that texture. So with that, I can make a decision. So actually, I'm gonna go for something simple. I'm gonna go for concrete, maps. I can go extra large. Pick one that looks good for the building. So I'm gonna try and use one like this. This is pretty clean. Something that's not gonna be too distracting. This one has kind of like the seams. It's pretty detailed, and the seams can help you give that touch of realism, like where it was precast or casted on site. But and it seems like it's be pretty easy to make seamless. So that's concrete J. So concrete flooring, concrete simple. It's set up for flooring, but that's fine. Concrete flooring J. And I've opened up that texture over here, and it shows up as a flooring texture. But that's fine. That's only because it's a preset from V-Ray. We'll create a texture from scratch for something else. But for now, I want to assign this texture to whatever objects in the seam are going to correspond to it. So I'm going to right-click it, and I can either select objects in the scene to add the texture to. I can apply to my selection, my current selection, or I can apply to a specific layer. So I'm going to apply it to my model layer 0, which I know is my existing building layer. And I'm going to also apply to my walls layer, as those are my additional walls to the project, to the existing project. So I'll double click on the snapshot to go to that view. And at this view, I'm going to start the interactive render and see how that texture is looking. Of course, I need to go to settings and I need to turn off material override. I think I might have to reload the render after turning off material override. And I'm going to edit this texture a little bit more up close. I'm going to make sure that it's applying to the proper layer. So I applied it to this object here, and I'm going to once again apply to the layer I intended to. It doesn't seem like it took. There we go. For some reason, it didn't apply earlier, but now that I just did it, it applied to the layer. So I can give this a second to render, and I can get up close to make sure that it's rendering properly on the surface. And you can see that the size of the texture isn't quite right. The detail is a little large. And there is a way to manipulate this just like we did with the environment. So here for the texture options on the right, we have this diffuse. So diffusion is the color that, or the image that texture or that object is going to reflect or is going to show the camera. And so we have this checker box over here for the texture slot. This is where that image that we previewed earlier is showing up. And the texture placement here allows you to remap how that texture is applying to the object. So since it is applying pretty evenly to all these objects, to all these different walls, and it's not any one particular wall that's giving me the issue, it looks like I'm going to be able to correct for the mapping directly into V-Ray. So here for 2D UV channel, that's how the material is being oriented or split up on the surface. Wherever you see these ISO curves, right, on the surface, that's basically determining how that texture is being mapped onto that object. So for UV, the repeat right now is to 1. So I'm gonna just go by doubling up on the U and the V until I get the right scale resolution. Now it takes quite a bit to re-render the entire scene. So if I wanted to just take a look at a variety of areas where this texture is being applied, I can use the region render tool up here in the preview window, select a region to update. So the next time I make a change, it only shows up in that little box. And then once I make sure that the changes are looking right in here, I can apply that to the entire wall or to the entire view. So that's looking pretty good. Any questions so far about importing a texture, manipulating its placement, or previewing it, any so forth? Nope. Okay. So with no questions, I'm gonna move on to starting a texture from scratch. So I'm gonna disable the render. I'm gonna go back to my main view. And the texture that I'm gonna start from scratch is gonna actually be for the mountains because I don't have to get it that right. I can play a lot and it's gonna give me an opportunity to show you a lot of different features for manipulating textures. So I'm gonna kind of look at this from an aerial view. By the way, I mentioned earlier you should pick all your views before you start working, but it's good to start with an aerial view because you want to go through the stages of adding details. So from an aerial view, your model won't need that much detail. You can work from further away. And as you go into your perspective view, your interiors view, you're adding detail on a need by need basis. Need to need basis? You know what I mean. So starting a texture from scratch, down here, instead of opening the import asset file, I'm gonna hit the create a new asset, and under materials, I'm going to create a blend material. So I'm actually gonna create 2 materials from scratch and then blend them together here as one. So I'm gonna then create another material called generic 1 or generic, right click on it to rename it. I'm gonna rename this mountain base. And this is gonna essentially have the base color for my mountain. Actually, let me go another way about this. I'm gonna actually rename this. I'm gonna call it mountain texture. Because what we're going to use to actually determine colors on this mountain, I'm going to start from an existing texture. So I'm going to go to my materials from V-Ray. Instead of creating a new one, I'm going to import, and I'm going to import a stone texture. Any random one will do because it's going to go through so many modifications, except for this one. I don't want that color because my lighting's already kind of that tone. And this one's brick. Not looking for brick. Is granite more organic? Okay, granite is more organic, so I'm gonna go with that. And my mountain texture, what I'm gonna do here is I'm actually gonna try and add a displacement so that the texture, the mountain model isn't that detailed. It's not that jagged. It's not that rocky. So I'm gonna add that feature through a texture rather than on the model. And I'm gonna do that by selecting that mountain texture I just created. And on the right side, I'm going to add an attribute. And I'm going to add displacement. It's going to be added under bump. Now, the difference between bump and displacement is bump will do it more subtly, like on the surface, to show darks and lights of, like, for example, brick. It'll show the roughness of the brick. But displacement is what you would use to actually bring out the rectangular shape of the brick from that flat surface. So bump is already enabled here, but there's no texture map here, texture slot for that bump. So the diffuse, I'm just gonna change the color here where it's gray to a very sort of pastel dark green, or yeah, dark green. There we go. And then I'm going to, for my bump map, hit the texture slot for that. And under the texture slot, earlier we used bitmap to do the HDRI, right? We selected that. You can just select a PNG, HDRI, JPEG through bitmaps. But there's many more options. If we go down, we have some that are more suited for our use. So for bump, for example, I'm going to do a granite bump, right? Since the granite texture kind of worked. And this is going to help to kind of create a sort of rocky effect on the texture. So I'm going to kind of just mess with the sliders here and just play around and look at the preview and make sure that I get something that, as far as like darks and lights go and colors go, something that is very heavy contrast, but not overly complicated. So that's fine. I'm going to go back, and that bump now is showing up on the texture here. You see, it kind of looks like it has a little, you might not be able to see through your screen. You can I could change the scale so you can see it better. There we go. So you make it that big. You might start to see some of those pebbles show up on the surface here, but I'm going to add another displacement on top. So that's the bump, but I'm going to add a displacement on top of that. So I'm going to enable displacement, open it up on the right, hit that texture slot. And for displacement, I'm actually going to pick rock. And so for rock, I'm going to make something, again, it's a little larger in size so you can see what's going on. That's pretty good. Get all the way dark, go back, and I'm gonna up that displacement a crazy amount. And hopefully you're able to see here the dark and the light greens, but it's given a very, very rough texture to the screen. And with that, if you remember, I'm gonna go back to my blend texture, add a layer here, or add a coat. My main coat is gonna be that granite texture I imported. And, oh, sorry, my base. My base is gonna be that granite texture I imported, and my material is going to be that my first coat of material is going to be that mountain texture. Now the displacement kind of went away in transferring over that mountain texture. So what I could do is actually, so it clearly didn't transfer. So I'm going to add that attribute to the blended texture. So I just selected over here to add that attribute. Displacement's been added to the blending texture. I'm gonna open up here the menu, and what I can do to save resources and make everything nice and even is I can go back to the mountain texture. I can right click on that displacement map I did in the texture slot, right click, copy. If I go back to my blend, I can right click on that texture slot and displacement for that blend texture, and I'm gonna paste as an instance rather than as a copy, so that way any changes I make on the other image is gonna show up here as well because they're linked. They're essentially using the same, what was it? Rock. The same rock texture slot or base is being used for both textures. So I'm gonna go ahead and go back to my snapshot view and see how this mountain texture looks. Any questions so far about bump, about displacement, about creating very simple textures and blending them together? Nope. Okay. All right. So the texture's showing up a little bit, not as much as I'd like. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go here for the displacement and I'm gonna mess with it a little bit more. I'm gonna see if I can get this to be all the way white so it's more pronounced. All right. Go back, it's not looking too bad. I can add a bump as well to the mountain. So I'm gonna do that as well. And I'm gonna actually copy the same displacement for this merge because the bump from the mountain was showing up, but I'm gonna add a bump to the blended texture as well and paste that displacement as an instance once again. Increase the bump level. We're getting something really rough here now. And again, you kind of just play with the sliders in order to see the preview over here and ultimately how it's going to transfer over there. Now, I do see that texture being applied to the mountain, but it's not nearly as rocky as I'd like it to be. I'd like the texture to repeat a lot more because, for example, I see this edge, this 3D bump right here that's happening. It should be a lot softer. It should be getting softer with the texture. So in order to map this texture properly, again, I could go to the settings for the bump and the displacement, right, on how that texture slot is being mapped, as I did before with the texture placement. But I'm actually going to show you right now how to do that through Rhino, because sometimes it may be more useful to do that through Rhino. So I'm going to minimize this, just keep my preview, and I'm going to pick a good view of the mountain I can work with. And with the mountain selected, over here on the Rhino properties, I have a texture mapping option here. If I click on that, I have many, many options for how this texture is mapped on this object. So I have custom mapping and unwrapping, which are the most advanced ways of mapping a texture, more detailed ways. Surface mapping, planar mapping, box mapping, spherical mapping. If you wanted to say, for example, if you wanted to do a beanbag chair, you would maybe get a threaded texture, like a 2D threaded texture. But if you do a spherical mapping, it'll kind of do rings of that on that sort of spherical object. What I'm going to do is I'm going to apply planar mapping so that I can select at what size that one image of the texture should be placed at. So if I make it smaller and hit enter, there we go. Now I'm seeing that displacement show up much, much more on the mountain. So I can hit that object again, hit apply planar mapping once more, make it even smaller, hit enter. Right, and just kind of try many different ways. So that's looking pretty good. If I go back to my main view, I'm going to see how that looks. So again, I'm mainly working through the V-Ray preview, not the, I'm looking how the lighting works mainly right now for the V-Ray preview of the scene. But I'm mostly working with the asset editor preview for these textures. And then I make sure I get that mapping right. Any questions so far on texture mapping? Because that's basically it. I'm manipulating textures in V-Ray, manipulating textures in Rhino, but all the textures for now are being used in V-Ray. Nope. Okay, no questions. Moving on. I remember applying that other texture. It's not showing up now. Open up my V-Ray asset editor. Stop the render, restart it. Okay, I'm gonna right click on concrete, apply that to my layers once more. Or just apply it to the objects that they're supposed to have directly. So this one. All right. So there's my concrete texture. Last texture I'm gonna make before we get into the cool stuff that's specific to V-Ray is gonna be how to make two-sided materials. So maybe you have in some part of the model a surface that has no 3D value, right? Maybe it's just a 2D surface. That could be the case with glass, for example. So that's the perfect example in this model to use a two-sided material, but leaves might also apply for this. So I'm gonna add a two-sided material. So create a new material, materials, select two-sided. And just like blend, two-sided is gonna have me add a material for the front and for the back. So almost as coats. So right now it's a blank texture. So I'm gonna open from the V-Ray default, the glass textures. And I'm just gonna go for something, maybe glass tinted orange. Why not? Sure. And now I'll go to the two-sided material, front material, glass tinted orange, back material, glass tinted orange. And my translucency, I can manipulate here if I don't get enough light coming through. So I'm gonna right click on two-sided and I'm going to apply to layer glass. There it is. Okay. So pretty dark. I'm gonna actually, from now, start to make sure I get this right because I wanna get my lighting right overall. There's not much light coming through, but then you'll also notice that there's no light coming through some of these objects, right? Some of these windows. So that's because the normal of this face needs to be flipped. So that face needs to be flipped to have its default face go forward, even though that glass texture is being applied. To both sides, it's only going to allow light through one side. There is a way to change that in more advanced material properties, or I think it's specific item properties, so you can make that it won't affect lighting, right? So if you make it so the glass doesn't affect lighting, the glass will still render there, but it won't affect the lighting at all. In this case, I do want it to affect the lighting of my interior shot, but since I don't have lights in the interior of the project right now, I don't need light to come out of the project. So I'm going to decrease the translucency here. Let's see, that makes it more opaque. Oh no, this is more reflectivity. So I'm going to bring it down. All right. So that's it for textures. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop this render. That's as far as I got over here. I'm going to close this. I'm going to save as, since I have this saved as a plain file. And I'm going to open the file I have that's much, much more worked on. Any questions as I switch over? Nope. All right. And give this a second to open. In the meantime, I'll say, I guess, also, if you've set up animations, I've seen a lot of people have been getting a lot of the After Effects workshops, exporting video animations of the render Rhino view, manipulating that in After Effects. If you have that path animation still set up in Rhino, all it takes is for you to set your V-Ray scene properly with your textures and your lighting. And then when you do the record animation command in Rhino, you could set your V-Ray as your main. If you put full render, it's going to use V-Ray. It's going to use your default render, your current renderer to render all your frames. So you can re-export your animation through V-Ray. And if you just composite it at the same way that you did the first time, you can just replace that clip in After Effects with the V-Ray render, and everything else stays the same. It's just switching one video for another higher quality one. For my project, I need to include a lot of trees. Is there a place where you can find good tree blocks for V-Ray? That's actually the next part I'm going to go over. But I wanted to show you this model over here. So here I have some trees, and these trees are actually terrible. I'm going to delete them all. I don't like them. I'm going to show you how to do a tree properly because it is pretty tricky. Well, it's not tricky. It's just there's a good way to do it so that you can have hundreds of trees and it not affect your computer. So I'm going to see what this scene looks like right now. I'm going to go to my interactive view here, do a quick render. So you can see I have many more materials. If you add a clipping plane to Rhino, it's going to add a clipping plane to your V-Ray asset editor. And so you can see here, you can turn that clipping plane on or off in your render independently of whether or not it's on or off in Rhino. And you can use that same object material for when you cut into it so that you actually see that same material. Or you can set a material here for your clipping plane or make it a color. You can set a generic material, make it dark matte black or bright red, and you can make your section show up as that color. I'm not interested in that though. So here you can see I also added a rectangular light. So a rectangular light has also a direction, just like the glass. It has a direction it'll show light on and not unless you enable double-sided for that rectangular light. You can see here the rectangular light is lighting the inside. So that light's spilling through. Now what you see in the background is actually, if I go to the main settings here, I have volumetric environment enabled over here, and I have it as environmental fog, or you can add it higher up as an aerial perspective. And then you can mess with those color of the fog, emission of the fog, distance, height, effects, et cetera, of the fog. And I mess with that in order to get it like this. The same technique I used for the mountains, I used for the water. You can see the water looks pretty good. I just messed also with the reflectivity. This isn't quite the file I was thinking because I corrected a lot of these textures already, but this is fine. For sand or for more organic things, such as this texture, I'm gonna find this one. It's pretty sure this soil. You can add a bump that uses, so here a bump is set to a bitmap, right? But I'm gonna actually change that. I'm gonna right click it. I'm gonna clear that texture slot. That's how you restart that texture slot, is you right click and you hit clear. I'm gonna do, what was it? Noise. And I'm gonna mess with the noise to kind of make it look like sand. Go back, increase the bump. I'm gonna add a displacement because it's not showing up enough. So I'm gonna add displacement. Copy, ooh, I hit cut. Whoops, copy. Paste as instance, so they're both the same. Increase the displacement. Make sure I have. It looks like it might be a texture placement issue, so I'm gonna mess with how the texture is placed. Again, since I used very large surfaces for the backdrop, I probably have to scale down all these textures that I'm using for the background, right? So for textures that are used more in the foreground, the texture mapping is going to be a little bit more even. But here you can see I'm going into adding 80 images, 100 images per surface, but it's actually correcting. And since I'm applying this onto a rectangle, it's a unique texture that's just for this rectangle, so I don't mind doing this texture mapping just for this one texture. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. It's a little too intense, so I'm gonna bring it down. But the shape looks right for sand. Try and make it a little bit softer. And remember, I'm editing the bump and the displacement together when I'm editing the image and its texture placement. Maybe too much. Okay, so trees. The reason why I had to go over that before adding trees is because when you download a tree block, what you want to do is you want to actually open it in its own file in Rhino. And it's going to have textures that probably came with it. Sorry, it's taking a lot for my computer to remember sand right now. There we go. I might have gone too intense with that sand just to show you the possibilities, but that's fine. So for a tree block, I'm going to add a tree over here, right? And the tree block you would download into its own Rhino file. And what you would do is you would actually, in V-Ray, in that blank Rhino file, you would export as a V-Ray mesh, V-Ray proxy. So you would just have that tree, you would import textures that OBJ comes with, and then you would export that from Rhino as a V-Ray mesh. So you're basically converting an OBJ through Rhino into a V-Ray mesh. Then when you go into your scene project, such as this one, I'm gonna actually hit here and I'm gonna do import a V-Ray mesh. And I'm gonna go find that tree that I exported, which I keep in my own library. V-Ray proxies. Here we go. And here it is. So it's not a block. So the thing with a block is if I select this wall over here in Rhino and I make it a block and I choose a base point, here it is. And I create a new block and I call it a wall or whatever, and I copy paste this wall. Rhino isn't creating two separate geometries. It's basically loading the same geometry twice, which saves a lot of resources on your computer. This takes it another step where Rhino hasn't even loaded this tree. It's just a preview of that OBJ, a really crappy preview of that 3D model that's actually loaded into my computer's RAM, and it's only going to be used by V-Ray when rendering. So here I have this tree, and I can copy paste it. Like I said, it's just a proxy. So when I do my preview now, my render in V-Ray, and I want to see this tree, I see now here I have tree 1 and tree 2. So the initial one I imported and the copy of it. So if I look at the render right now, it's taking a little long for it to load for me. Tell you what, I'm going to stop the render. I'm going to go back to my simple file to do this tree stuff. I just wanted to show you some stuff like the environmental effects you can do. I'm going to go back to my plane, and I'm going to do the tree stuff over there. From what online page did I download these proxies? I actually have it open here because I revisited the model recently to make sure I was doing the texture right. Just kidding, I closed that tab. Did I? Yeah. Sorry, unfortunately closed that tab. But I mean, those trees I downloaded from. I'll provide a link. I could provide a link in the chat once I'm done here explaining, because I got to get through this tree stuff and exporting a render and animation in the next 10-15 minutes. And then I'll pull that up. Actually, trying to think if there's a way. to communicate with you. I mean, my Zoom ID is my faculty email that's been going around, ramirjewel@fiu.edu. So if you add me on Zoom, you can feel free to send me a message through there. If you need any links or resources, or if you want a crit before your final crit, anything like that. I've been taking a lot of appointments with students lately to do that kind of stuff. So if it's more technical stuff, I like doing that sometimes more than the conceptual stuff. Clearly, I didn't save my changes to my plane file earlier. And my trees are still here, but bear with me for just a minute longer that I can manipulate this file, and we'll do the tree blocks. Any other questions? We'll wait for this Rhino to load. Alrighty. You know what? I think it was trying to load something I don't even need. So I'm just going to delete these trees and start from scratch. So those trees are actually bad trees. I figured out a much better way to do trees in V-Ray, and it really took a lot of experimentation to get here because I couldn't find anything online to get it. Yeah, I'll write my email in the chat right now. And so I'm in over here where I was to download that V-Ray mesh, and I'm going to download that tree once again. Bring it over, and when I see it over here, I'm going to now do that. Again, I reverted to a much simpler version of the file before I even did the lighting or the texturing with you. So it's very, very blank. So as you can see in my assets, I have that tree over here, and it's showing up with a color material, right? It has no material assigned to it, but it has a drop down here to choose a material, right? So the thing is, materials need to be re-uploaded for proxy models, and it's better to download a model that has textures that are mapped properly to it. So in this case, the texture that came for this tree looked like this, right? Really, really crappy. What you see down here is the bark, and what you see up here is the branches. Can I just get someone on the chat to make sure that you can see this Photoshop all right? But what I did then was I added a bark, much, much better bark layer. And I added some, you know, well-clipped branches. And I saved over it. And I saved it as actually as a PNG so that I could get that checkered area, that clear area, to show up completely black. So that when I'm in Rhino, I can create a new material. So I'll create a new material, generic, and I'll call it the tree tree one. I'll name the material the same as the proxy model. Oops, tree one. Okay, it doesn't want to change to tree one, maybe because it's already taken by an asset, tree one texture. There we go. And for the texture slot, for the diffuse layer on this new texture, again, we go to bitmap, and I'm gonna find wherever I downloaded that 3D model, resources, 3D trees. I'm gonna find that texture file I created in Photoshop right here, mossy tree PNG. I'm gonna upload it as a texture, and it's gonna weirdly like distort all this exterior part of the branches, but that's fine. It's just how it's reading that clear area on the PNG. Now if I go back, I'll see that texture mapped onto this object pretty strangely, but I'm gonna go ahead and add it to the tree already. So I'm gonna go to that tree asset right here under my geometries. And for material, I'm gonna select that tree one texture. And you can see the way that the model's set up and the way the texture's set up, the bark is going where it's supposed to go. and the leaves are going where they're supposed to go. Only thing is, these really choppy meshes that are supposed to look like leaves look like surfaces, right? They look like jagged surfaces. So to correct that, I need to go back over here to my texture, and there's a section here under V-Ray material for opacity. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna right click on copying that texture slot. I'm gonna right click on this texture slot, but instead of pasting as an instance, I'm gonna paste as a copy so that I can make changes to it by clicking on it. And the thing here is that I gotta make a way so that, I mean, you can see already how that opacity is changing the tree, but it's changing the opacity on the bark as well, on the branches and stuff that it's not supposed to. So the way I figured out how to make it work was to actually change here the color space that I'm working in and do a custom gamma curve. And by increasing the gamma curve ridiculously, I was actually able to increase the opacity of the areas that have solid image and decrease the opacity of the edges that don't. You can do things here like invert the texture for opacity. And again, like all these things that you change for opacity are just going to mess with the opacity of the overall object. It's not going to mess with the actual texture that you were using because I copied as an, because I pasted as a copy, not as an instance. Another good trick to do for these tree textures is to do the same thing we did for the glass. So I'm going to do a two-sided texture. Textures, two-sided, sorry, materials, two-sided. There we go. For both sides. Now I'm actually going to do a duplicate of the tree texture. And under the diffuse texture slot, I'm actually going to cut a manipulation and I'm going to do a color offset. And this is just going to make the leaves look more unique and make the whole tree look a lot more dynamic by just having different tones on one side of the leaf than the other. And I'm going to add one as the front, one as the back. And I'm going to change the texture of that tree to the new two-sided texture. All right. Best looking tree so far. Again, I'm right up close to it. If I go back to my scene, which doesn't exist anymore because I didn't save, right? It looks like crap in Rhino. It looks great in V-Ray. Only thing I'm gonna say is that I messed up because before you do your texture, you wanna copy paste that tree as many times as you're gonna need to. I was working on a little grasshopper script that I could share later when I figure out how to do, I want to do this same thing I just did, but I want to do it with 2D trees for backdrops because it'll take a lot, even less resources, right? But for now, I've worked on a grasshopper script. I know more people are getting onto using grasshopper, but I've done a script where I can do a mesh. I can get the points from that mesh. Because V-Ray also installs into your Grasshopper, by the way. There's V-Ray components for Grasshopper. There's just a very specific way for them to work. But here, I'm just pulling up a whole bunch of points from the mesh. I'm gonna get rid of most of them. This is the last thing and we're done. So for here, I have 900 trees, still too many. So this is really like a random way of setting up trees, but it's fine. 600 trees, geez. Almost there. I'm just like making a very, very simple, basic true-false condition with a whole bunch of falses, a whole bunch of trues, so that the 3,600 points on this mesh turn into 240. And then I can apply this mesh to those many, many points. I'm a little concerned. I don't want to crash anything, so I'm just for safety going to decrease more of the points. 180, sure. Don't think I did that right. Well, in any case, this is just a quick, simple script that's similar to the one I was using, but it's not working properly. I have another one I can share with all of you on the Google Drive where the videos have been being uploaded to. But essentially, then you can bring back these meshes into Rhino and apply that same texture. But the thing is, if you copy paste in Rhino, notice it's copy pasting the two-sided texture assigned to it as well. So Grasshopper is a good way to map trees all over the model. If you copy paste in Rhino, make sure you do so before you create your textures, because then you can just go in and assign the same texture for all your trees, rather than creating a duplicate texture for each tree when you copy paste, because it is going to duplicate that texture unless you duplicate it in V-Ray. If I select this tree over here and I duplicate in V-Ray, and then I select this whole mess of trees, or I keep duplicating this tree over and over to then move it around, it's going to share that texture if I duplicate in V-Ray. So again, just really little technical things, good to know to keep your resources low. But as you can see, with this many trees and with trees actually having texture, my render is still working just fine because this tree model is a proxy. Okay, that just about covers what I had to go over. Oh, except exporting. Let me do that. We are scheduled to run for another 7 minutes, so it is perfect, and then I'll take any other questions. So here in main settings, I have all my view stuff fine. I'm gonna, select a view here, maybe get rid of all those grasshopper trees. A lot of windows going on, so working with 2 monitors here is definitely a plus. Now, the engine, this whole time I've been running on CPU. I would recommend you run on CUDA if you have GTX graphic cards. If you have the new line of NVIDIA graphic cards, RTXs, you can look here for RTX. And then the 3 dots here are going to show you how many graphics cards you're using in your mode. So I'm going to select CUDA. I have 2 1070s on my desktop, but I'm only using one right now. I'm going to click on the other one so that I use both 1070s. And I'm going to switch off of interactive mode and into progressive mode. Quality, I'm going to leave it at high. Denoiser, I'm going to use the NVIDIA AI Denoiser. It's faster than the V-Ray, much better too. Camera, I set all that up earlier. Advanced camera and all that stuff I worked with you. Render output, so here I'm going to select the resolution. So, whichever aspect ratio, file path. So very important, you enable save image and that you select a file path, especially if you're doing animations. So as you can see here, when you run the recording of an animation from Rhino, all your frames are saving into one folder with the same name and they're numbered, right? So I'm going to create a subfolder here for frames. I'm going to choose to save my render there. And then I can enable my animation setting here if I've already set an animation in Rhino. So if I've set an animation in Rhino or in Grasshopper, I can enable animation here and I can select Rhino. And if I had one in Grasshopper, it would also show up here. I would select the frame range that V-Ray is going to render. I can get that animation range from the settings in Rhino. So clearly in Rhino, I had set up an animation of 300 frames. And so it's starting at 0 and ending at 299 for 300 frames. And that's it. I'm all set to do a render. So if I do a progressive render here, right, instead of an interactive render, because I don't have that little click symbol anymore, the hand with the index finger pointed, and I crashed my Rhino. That's the first time that happens for me with this model. So I'm going to open one that I know is going to work. Or you know what? I'm just going to show you an animation with a box. So I'm going to do a box. Let's see my V-Ray progressive render. I mean, it's not the same thing, but I'm just trying to show you how to export an animation. So setting a path animation. Set a camera path, set a target path, 300 frames, JPEG, capture method, full render, render full, right, from perspective view. And then again, set up my animation settings in V-Ray for the entire animation. I'm gonna check out that render once more. So that's the beginning of the animation. I'm gonna make sure that I'm gonna hit stop on V-Ray to stop the rendering of the animation. Whoops, I'm going to move the curves up. Start the render again. There, I'm at the middle of the box. I'm gonna hit stop. And now what I'm gonna do is record animation from Rhino. And I could select the target folder, but it doesn't matter because it's ultimately gonna be V-Ray that's rendering. So I wanna make sure that I have my save image set in V-Ray for where it's gonna save. And I can set a target folder for the recording in Rhino too, but it's less important. So please enter to start recording, and it's gonna say, please wait for the current render to finish. Ignore that, just hit enter. And it's gonna start loading the first frame. And once it saves the first frame, it's gonna move on to the next frame and to the next frame and to the next frame until you have all your JPEGs in that folder, and then you can compose them in Photoshop. So there you have it. Full workflow from setting up lighting to textures, environment, and exporting an animation in just an hour and 15 minutes. So I try to be very to the point. My crash over there at the end, I'm not sure what to attribute it to. I was having no issues with a couple trees. Maybe when it got to a lot more trees, there was an issue. Although I also noticed I was running the whole time on CPU, not on GPU. So I was also getting a false idea of how the render was working once I switched to the GPU for that final render. So you want to make sure that however you're doing your rendering, you're using the adequate resources, you have your adequate settings in the main settings panel. One more thing, little bonus. There is a material called a Toon Material. So Toon Materials are a little more illustrative. These do need to run on the CPU. They cannot run on your GPU. So I'm gonna set this new path animation with a lot less frames. So you could see big jumps between frames for the Toon Material. And the Toon Material is gonna need a base material again. So I'm gonna do a generic material, make it bright orange. And for the Toon Material, I need a base material, which is going to be that bright orange. But you notice here, line color, opacity, line width, and you could hit advanced settings here. You could switch to advanced settings where you're adding attributes or adding layers is usually at. So by having advanced settings, you could add a silhouette to the texture. You could change where lines start showing up. So if you'll notice, there's usually a little crease here on the texture preview. So if I mess with the threshold, you can see I can take smaller lines to start showing up. Okay, so if I lower the threshold down there, that looks pretty good. I can adjust the distance of the stroke to the camera, but in any case, I'm going to apply that texture to the selection. I'm going to switch to interactive, so I'm not able to do the animation. And this is what the Toon Material looks like. For now, I can only see the outline. I don't want divide by distance enabled. I want to increase line width. Something I've had to do with Toon Materials a lot is scale the whole model. So if you are going to do Toon stuff and it's going to be like diagrammatic, or if you want to do this like more illustrative look to your model, you may have to rescale the model sort of abstractly just to get those lines to show up. Yeah, I'm running on the CPU, interactive. So now I'm gonna switch back to progressive mode in CPU mode, and then record animation in order to the record animation with the Toon Material. I didn't change the view, but you can tell what's happening here. It's just rotating around the object, and you can see there how it's showing up. Again, you can play a lot more with the Toon Material in the scene settings to get that Toon Material just right. If I show you a sample of Toon Materials I worked on, I'll pull them up right here. And as I pull them up, any questions before we wrap up? Through microphone or through chat is fine. All right. Be sure to email me if you need any help with Rhino, illustration, rendering, animation. I've been helping out a lot with After Effects, not so much in Photoshop, but there's stuff in Photoshop that you've seen plays into texturing in V-Ray as well as After Effects. Not here. Yep, I did the big mistake of putting it to my desktop. So these are a couple textures I created in V-Ray. Here you can see one of them is emissive, meaning it emits light. And they're really, really complex meshes. So all of this sort of black texturing is actually a bunch of little lines from that Toon effect. Besides the Toon materials, the default Toon materials, here's that render from the other file with Toon materials as well. But besides creating a Toon material, you could also import one. So if I go back to interactive mode, the diagrammatic section of the materials from V-Ray has Toon materials. So you can see here, you even have 3D print materials, fake glass, model materials. Here's the Toon materials. So if I select this one, for example, it's like a bluish. There, the lines are showing up pretty good. I can open a new material. There's some wireframe illuminated ones, wireframe transparent ones, but the wireframe will kind of show you also kind of the digital topology of that texture. And you can mix and match these. So these could be, you know, right next to each other. And you can combine. Yep, all this different stuff. All right, so since nobody has a question, post to the chat or through mic, we're gonna wrap up there. I'm gonna post this video on the Google Drive folder where the previous recordings are. Be sure to send me a question if anything. I'd love to see some renders and give some feedback. But yeah, next week is finals, so I'm gonna be tied up with reviews, but since the shop is closed and it doesn't look like we're still looking for what the situation will be in summer. But it looks like I'm going to be doing a lot of the supplemental workshops for a while. So regardless, finals in between semesters, summer semester, I'm going to be doing one of these workshops a week every Thursday between 12 and 2. We switched to 12 this week because of redlining happening during studio. So that's it. I hope you all enjoy your afternoon. Hope to hear from all of you. Cutting out the meeting. Bye.
Julian.
Oh.
Yeah, I have one question for you.
Right.
I'm not getting this email from you. Like to get onto this chat. I'm getting it from my professor. So how would I be able to get it from you?
You don't get it from me. You do get it from your professor. These workshops are planned out. I put them through with Chandler, make sure that it works for what the professors are teaching, and then the professors are sharing it with you. Did your professor share too late? Is that what happened? Or
No, he didn't. I was just wondering because once it's obviously like the semester's over and then we go into summer, I was wondering how am I going to get onto these chats?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
I'll be sending out an email. The same way you've been getting these, we'll send out an email on how to follow up for future workshops. I'll set up an infrastructure so that you can get the notifications without depending on school administration.
Yeah, because I normally get the emails from the workshop that you send out, like when or like for when the wood shop and stuff is closed. I get those from you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for general announcements, I do have a list of students that I send out to. However, for these workshops, they were intended to be specifically for D6. Then they opened up for sort of anyone. And I'm actually not sure who the audience is currently. I imagine it's mainly D6 because that's mainly the work I've been seeing in After Effects. But yeah, so for now, the communication has been through professors. I can communicate with you directly in the future, but for that email communicating how you'll be notified, it'll be the same way you've been notified with all these Zoom meetings.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too. Bye, everybody.